All right, let's go to that economic news now. Joining me, Sky News Business Editor Ross Greenwood. The story out today, obviously, less than expected or better than expected inflation data. Improvement, as I said just then with Andrew, still high, still almost double where the RBA wants to get it to in terms of that 2 to 3% band, Ross. How did you read the drop today, and what does it sort of weight for you where the RBA might go when it meets again on Tuesday?
You get a sense the Reserve Bank's got time now to wait. It would appear as though after 12 interest rate rises, the strategy is working. Remember, Philip Lowe has said that he wants the inflation rate to effectively glide down towards that 2 and 3% band by 2025. So it's got some time to go. Now, you have a look at that April to June period, that quarter. So multiply that by 4, you've got inflation at about 3.2%. Now, what happens with inflation in the coming quarters is yet to be seen. But there's some evidence of it. They put out the monthly inflation number today as well for July, which showed annual inflation of just 5.4%. So there's real evidence that inflation is falling. And here's that monthly number there you can see. So you can see really it did peak back late last year
that is good.
And has been
That
progressively falling. So it's good news, and also good news for interest rates, Peter, you'd have to say as well.
Yeah, when you see it in the trend graph like that, I think it really underscores how well that number has moved down this year. Rents up 2.5%. International travel, this one surprised me, 6.2%. But anyone who's booked an overseas ticket in recent times will tell you they are extraordinarily expensive. The government, though, is still bringing in 750,000 migrants between now and the end of June next year. They blocked Qatar from offering extra flights, Sydney, Brisbane and Melbourne, to help drive down some of those costs for airline travellers. So was the government making inflation worse or better? Is the heavy lifting being done by the bank? What do you think?
Well, the heavy lifting certainly been done by the bank. There's no doubt about that. And remember that in government policy is often slower to come through in terms of actual inflation outcomes. The real issue, of course, that the government's been involved in is the push for higher wages. Now, at some point in the future, there is going to be a point at which the wage growth that we're seeing is going to be higher than inflation. As the inflation falls, the wage claims are going to keep on going. And I just wonder, and I do wonder whether Labor politicians, Tony Burke, and whether unions are going to be calling for wage restraint and wage falls for workers at that time. That ain't going to happen, as you know. But it's really interesting to note at this point in time, the calls for wage rises are in response to the rising prices, which are reasonable. But then there's a point at which this tips the other way. And then the response of the government and the response of the unions is going to be fascinating to see whether they continue to argue. They won't, of course. They'll say there's a bit of catch-up to be made there. But that also is a period that is perhaps 12 to 18 months' time away, when interest rates by that stage will have already started to fall in response to a weakening economy here in Australia.
Ross, how's this play on 850,000 casual workers being able, after 6 months' service, to move into being permanent staff? How's that going to play out into this economic data, in particular for small business?
Do you know what the real problem, and this is where Tony Burke in the past few days has started to really say that there could be some sort of a carve out for small business coming, for small businesses that employ fewer than 20 people, that maybe they become exempt, that something around that lines has to happen. The reason for that is if you've got an economic slowdown coming, and then you have the ability for an employee to say after 6 months, hey, I wish to be a permanent employee, and you, the employer, can't do anything about it, well, then there's arguments then about whether the employer will take that person on in the first place, or indeed whether then redundancies start to take place and unemployment starts to rise faster. The trick of this economy right now, the Reserve Bank has said, is to try and get the inflation rate to glide down, while at the same time holding as many people in jobs as you possibly can. Because people in jobs is good for families, it's good for the economy, and it's certainly good for the government and its budget. So really that strategy of trying to have people hold as many jobs as possible, I think, is vital for the survival of many Australian families. That position on casual employment almost plays against that. And that's the fundamental problem, I think, economically with the government's plan. You're
about the only person I've listened to in the last couple of weeks who've made that argument as simply as you have. This is why my audience love you, Ross Greenwood. Thank you as always.
Quite okay.